Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today. As the name suggests, this webinar is set to simplify really how you secure and manage identities and access within your organization through utilizing Microsoft Entra. I had the pleasure of sharing the stage with Microsoft's Chief Security Advisor, often seen across Europe, Sarah Armstrong-Smith. And at our Cyber Summit, identity was a topic much talked about. Indeed, Sarah revealed that identity-based attacks were now surpassing endpoints as the primary attack vector. And I guess Microsoft are supremely well placed to qualify that with almost 78 and growing trillion signals that they process daily. I think John himself will reference some of the Digital Defense Report. And that report itself referenced 350 million such attacks daily. 99% of those were involving password sprays. Indeed, Sarah added additional context with some of the attacks that Microsoft were themselves facing, as obviously an attractive target to adversaries out there. One of the key learnings for them was that identity as a threat vector was resoundingly endorsed as a key focus area for additioning layered defense. And if Microsoft themselves are doing it, then who are we to certainly not agree with that? So defending identities has never been more important. And in this session, we will be starting to get into how unlocking Entra tooling and capability can start to really make a difference in securing access and building on businesses' journeys towards zero trust. So look, before we get into the real session, I just want to remind you, we do have a Q&A session, so we're going to be covering quite a bit today. And if there are any questions that come to mind, we will be looking to get into those towards the end. I think there's about 10 minutes for it, assuming we go to the timing. And you'll notice there's a Q&A tab, and if you can pop them in there, then that would be much appreciated. So before we get going again, let me introduce, say the brains behind this session and the experts that you'll be hearing from. So firstly, with us we have John Burnett. John is a cybersecurity specialist, a global black belt from Microsoft, specializing in advanced identity, and really primary focus is trying to help businesses and customers to get the most out of the Microsoft identity tooling and solutions, as well as, of course, the Microsoft wider security portfolio. Today, John will be setting the scene for us and highlighting some of the top risks that he and Microsoft have seen in 2024 and how this impacts zero trust needs for businesses today. To follow on from that, we've got Alan, our very own Alan Armstrong. He heads up our Cloud Security Identity team, ITC. Alan himself is most valuable professional MVP status, specializing in SIEM, XDR, cloud security. And today he'll be providing an update in more detail as an overview of the Microsoft Entra suite, and in particularly drilling down into global secure access and how businesses can benefit from that and deploy it and get started on that journey. So look, before we, just to make sure that everyone's awake post-lunch, before I hand over to John, we've just got a couple of polls that will also help to give us a bit more context as we move through this. But Sophia, could I ask you please to launch the first poll? I can see it's on the screen. So if each of you please could address that. So the question is, what is your primary goal for using Entra? Choices are enhancing security, simplifying access management, improving compliance, or something else. And if you could please answer that. It's fascinating to see these bars move. Okay, we've got seemingly two clear winners, maybe one really. Enhancing security. Okay, and I think that, okay, that's a sound winner, and I think that makes a hell of a lot of sense. Just wait, we've almost got everyone responding. Okay, right, so enhancing security, okay, and again, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess you'd argue that simplifying access management, of course, is part of that as well. But okay, thank you. Sophia, could we go to the next poll, please? So the second question, how do you currently manage secure access to the internet and your cloud applications today? And again, if you could please click one of the solutions. Okay, and I think that also, John Allen, makes a lot of sense with some of the top answers there, taking distribution of answers across those. Okay, thank you. So I now know everyone's engaged and fully. So at that point, I guess I've done my job to some extent. John, I'll pass over to you, please. Thank you.
Great. Thanks ever so much, Mark, and thanks everyone for joining this session today. And as it says on the screen there, at the moment, this is sort of like where what's Microsoft's approach to sort of like enabling zero trust, and what ultimately do you mean by that? If we can imagine that we're in a world where when we're onboarding a user, either a new user or an existing user to an environment, and we're able to, based on who that individual is, based on the role and the function that is that they've got within the organization, we're empowered and enabled to actually give them the access to the resources, whether that be network resources, cloud applications, on-premise applications, security groups, licenses, and to be able to have that centrally managed through a group of processes, which is not looked after by, I'm going to say looked after by IT. They are not the ones who are in charge. The ones who are in charge are the business owners. They can actually determine that the individuals are in the groups that they are because they are the functions that they're performing within the organization. And they only have access to what they are implicitly given to, either on a network level or on sort of like on an internet or on an application on a group level. But if we move to the next slide, we can start seeing sort of like how sort of like the Microsoft approach is, and sort of like, as Mark was saying before, what are those insights that we're seeing from our threat report last year? So every year, Microsoft, we create what we call the digital defense reports, where we take a summary of everything that it is that we've seen. And Mark mentioned it before, that the trillions of signals that we get every single day, and our threat researchers and intelligence guys then go through all of that data and then sort of like position sort of like what we've seen and what are the targeting. And as Mark mentioned, there's a couple there that we wanted to be able to touch on as from an identity perspective. And the first one is that identity has overtaken endpoints as the primary attack vector. Used to be, you know, the easy way in was to be able to sort of like potentially target individual devices. And I see this as because organizations are starting to do a better job with rolling things like EDR capabilities out, and also keeping their devices up to date, patch management, and the elements around hygiene that sort of like that security has been talking about for a number of years within there. Now, sort of like, you know, the attackers, they're sort of like saying, right, let's go and have a they're always trying to find the easiest way in, right? And right now, that's swinging away from endpoints towards identities, or that's the experience that we saw within 2024. And we all know sort of like stories that we've heard on sort of like in the media about organizations that maybe sort of like someone's phoned up a help desk, pretended to be one of their employees, managed to get the help desk to change that password, and then they've leveraged that identity and that new sort of like change password to get into that organization to sort of potentially sort of like go through, exfiltrate data before sort of like security have an opportunity to be able to see that, and sort of like using that social engineering to be able to get in there. And the second sort of like comment there that we wanted to have a look at there is that ransomware encounters, even though they've gone up by 2.5 times, their success rate has gone down. And again, this is another thing around organizations sort of like being able to sort of like have more resilient environments, again, keeping their devices up to date, making sure that their backups are sort of like in place. That's always the best way to be able to get yourself back from a ransomware attack, is to be able to have high quality backups that you're able to be able to get yourself back from. So again, we're starting to see identity as something that needs to be sort of like focused on. And as most most of you clicked on the in the poll earlier on. Enhancing security is the reason why it is that you're here today, and sort of like what is it that you could do within this the Microsoft tooling to be able to do that. So if we move on to the next slide, we can start seeing sort of like the summary around from the Microsoft point of view of sort of like what we're having a look at with those solution areas within Entra. So let's talk around Entra first of all. Entra is the brand name that Microsoft we've got for anything that surrounds identity. So like we've got Entra ID, it's obviously what was previously Azure AD, with sort of like all of your identities and being able to sort of like control in a single place what your users have got access to and the groups that it is that they've got access to. We're now sort of like having a look at expanding those capabilities out and so being able to say, right, okay, how could you enforce zero trust controls? How can you make sure that a user only has access to what they're implicitly given access to at the time that they are given access to it? And again, all of those things depend on the situations that from where are they accessing from, how are they accessing, what device are they accessing, what is the risk level of their particular identity that it is that we've seen. How do we make sure that your partners and your customers that are accessing your resources are also secure? What can we do in order to be able to control that and to be able to facilitate that secure access? And also, look, we want to make sure that you've got sort of access, no matter whether you're in Azure, AWS, GCP, or your on-premise data centers, that again, you're able to sort of like put those controls in place no matter where they are. And if we have a look at the next slide, we can start seeing sort of like what we've got within sort of like what we call the Entra Suite. So within Entra Suite, this is a group of products that we've based on top of everything that we've got within Entra ID. And we've got Entra Private Access, which is allowing your users to be able to have access to those on-premise resources, but only to the specific network resources they're implicitly given to. This is a bit like a user-based VPN, and I'm going to drill into that a little bit later on around that one. With Entra Internet Access, we can also see whether or not control access to SaaS-based applications and also particular URLs and sort of like sites on the internet to be able to control them. With ID governance, we can actually determine what are we actually going to give users access to, what do they need access to within their role, and how do we control the life cycle of those individual users there. With identity protection, this is where those trillions of signals that Mark mentioned before, this is where we take those and we use those to determine the risk profile of users. Sort of like the telemetry tells us that like, has a user been contacting with specific IP addresses that are considered to be malicious? Has there emails that have come in into those individual users? And being able to determine the risk profile of a user and then leveraging that in order to be able to control the access. And we'll see on the next slide how all of these fit together. And lastly, verified ID, leveraging facial recognition in order to be able to control the access to those resources. And yet, if we do move to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So as we have a look at this slide, so let's have a look at this journey from left to right. So the first thing that you do is just sort of like when you're onboarding the users, if we just click once more on that slide, that would be great as well. Perfect, there we go. As we're sort of like onboarding those employees. So leveraging verified ID, what is verified ID? This is where we use sort of like facial recognition to prove and validate that the person who's making the request, whatever it might be, is exactly who it is that they say they are. This could integrate with driving licenses and passports, so we can prove that the individual that you're onboarding to your system for the first time is actually the person that they say they are, and you can integrate with those sort of like government institutions and to be able to prove. And what it actually does is that it takes the sort of like uses the photo within on the system and compares that to the face that's in front of the system at the moment, and actually then has a look at that one. But we can use that to verify and validate. So if we take that previous example, and if we just jump onto the next slide, we can have a look at that very quickly. So if we have a look at that example around the challenge that customer was experienced, that somebody phoned up their help desk and sort of like pretended to be someone else. In this particular example, this is someone trying to get access to the help desk in order to be able to open a ticket, make a change, whatever it might be at that point in time. And then they're using sort of like verified ID and their identity. So this could be sort of like a digital passport that you've got, sort of like in this particular example, we can see sort of like the name of the customer is Woodgrove, and then we've got our end user there in the middle. So the end user there is trying to get access to the Woodgrove help desk, and in order to do that, the sort of like verified ID is saying we need to do a face check recognition. We can then see that the face in front of the phone is then being compared to that photo down the bottom there. That could be on your HR system, that could be sort of like on LinkedIn, again, that could be on a government entity. It can be anything that you can integrate with at the back end, and verifying and proving that you are who you say that you are. In that particular example, on the right hand side there, we can see that the results of that particular face check is 95% compared with the photo that's got. Approved to be able to go through, and then we can carry on with our help desk. So if it's a password reset, which was the example from before, we've now mitigated the fact that somebody's pretending to be somebody else, or at least reduced that risk significantly within there. And this could be for any particular request that that user has, again, whether they're onboarding or whether they're wanting to get access to additional resources, groups of or applications within the environment. If we just move forward and we're going back to the slide that we were looking at before. So that's the first thing. What have we done? We've proven that the individual is who they say they are. We now know that the person that we're communicating with is definitely who they say they are, because we've validated their face against the photo on our internal systems. And again, this could be something that you use for partners externally as well. And I've seen some sort of like government organizations, they use this as a digital passport as individuals move around the organization, and also use those to prove and validate that that individual has got the credentials that it is that they need to be able to do their job. Have they kept their privacy up to date with their training that they need to be able to do? Have they got their certifications, etc., and have they passed all of their security clearances, for example? So all of those could be stored again on that identity. The second piece there is governing access. So now we've proven who the users say they are. What should that user actually have access to? And we can use lifecycle automation to prove that when they join the organization, they get their birthright assignments. That's all that they get access to, unless they get access to additional sort of like elements because of their job. This can plug into your HR system internally. So any changes within your HR system then trigger and adjust what that user has access to. So if I join and I join the IT team, I get access to all the IT applications, and I get access to maybe Microsoft 365 and some of the internal applications. If I then move out of the IT team into the legal team, for example, I lose all of the access that I had within IT, and I gain all of the access that I need in order to do my legal function. All this is automated and audited at the back end. It also goes through an approval process. So as I move through those elements will then go to a manager to say, yes, John's moving from the IT to the legal team. That is what we need to be able to prove. All audited, all documented for you to be able to see there. If I feel like I need more access, I can put a request into the process and get access to the groups or the sort of like the applications. And what we'll come to in a moment is even the internet, all on those on-premise resources that it is that I need, and to sort of like put a request in. And again, that will go through its approval process and be audited there. So we verified that I am who I say that I am. I only have access to what is that I am implicitly given. The next part of it is that it then has to look at my identity, and we're continuously assessing my particular identity to determine, is there any risk? And if there is, we can actually rescind some of those access on those rights that we were given on the previously, because we're seeing a risky approach from your users, and leveraging conditional access policies in order to be able to control that, and comparing that against everything that we're seeing in those trillions of signals that Microsoft is gathering there for you on your behalf. And then we can sort of like control what a user has access to on the internet. So we can prevent users from going to malicious websites that aren't appropriate for their role and their day job. But if they need access and there are exceptions based on their identity, we can make sure that those individuals have access to. An example I often use is you don't want anyone to have access to mass storage, sort of like cloud mass storage areas such as Dropbox or Box, for example. But maybe your legal team do need to have access to Box in order to be able to share documents and files with sort of like their outside lawyers, and to be able to compare those notes. You can now say the legal team, because they're in the group assigned to through ID governance have got access to sort of like those cloud mass storage areas, but no one else within the organization have. And if someone leaves that team, those permissions get rescinded. So now what you could do is you control what a user has access to on the internet based on their role and their function. And again, they could either say, I need to have access to cloud mass storage devices. That could go through the governance process. It could go through facial recognition to prove that they need that they are who they say they are. And then for a time frame, they could actually have access to those internet resources, all controlled through central policy, and doesn't need the IT team to make adjustments into the cloud proxy. It doesn't need to make adjustments into sort of like the firewall rules that it is that they've got. And lastly, before I hand over to Alan, we're sort of like Entra private access. This is where we give access to those private resources, either your on-premise resources or whether it's in AWS, Azure, or GCP, for example. So you can have control down to an IP address or a TCP port or a UDP port that they're having access to. So if, for example, you're an admin, you want to be able to get access to a server in order to be able to do some upgrades and some patching, for example, you could put a request in through ID governance to say, I need sort of like RDP access through to this particular server. You use verified ID to prove that you are who you say you are, and then you only have access to that server on port 3389 for the time frame that you need in order to be able to do that administrative work. All of those have got conditional access policies in front of them. So now what you could do, if you think about it, you can put conditional access policies in front of any on-premise application that it is that you might have. So rather than uploading that into the cloud, you can now sort of like have that that application, as long as it's got a TCP and a UDP port, you can now put the controls in place in front of them. So now what you could do is that you have got if to control the blast radius of any user that you've got within the organization. So if they do click on a link that they shouldn't have clicked on, you know that they've only got access to the network, the internet, and the sort of like the files resources that you have implicitly given those particular users. And all of that is centrally controlled from the left to the right, verified ID proving who they say they are, ID governance controlling access both to the applications, the groups, the internet, and those individual VPNs, meaning that your team within IT don't need to make those adjustments centrally then. So this is sort of like what we've got within the Entra suite within Microsoft, and sort of like it's great to sort of like be with Alan, who's sort of like going to go in on how ITC can sort of like help you deliver and deploy these tools within your environment. So over to you, Alan. But on to the next slide, say thank you ever so much for everyone's time today.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Yeah, if you can go to the next one. So I'm just going to do a quick recap on what John has said around the Entra suite. So again, we're talking around the Microsoft Entra private access, internet access, the Entra ID governance to manage identity lifecycles, the identity protection, securing the identities themselves, and as well as what John said, verifying who is asking for access or access to the tenant, verifying who they are. If we just go to the next slide. So this is in effect Microsoft's how we're using zero trust with Microsoft and the various components that the Microsoft sort of offer. This is in effect highlighting or where we've got highlighted the Entra sort of solutions that can help with that sort of area. So we can see it's pretty much across the whole board. It is also covered in apps as well on the right hand side. So identity, as John was saying, is key now to securing access to environments across the board. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to dive in a little bit more around global secure access. So talking around private access and internet access. So when we break it down within that sort of solution, it's broken down to 3 profiles. So we've got 365 traffic, internet traffic, and the private traffic. If I start from Microsoft 365 traffic, so this is securing the traffic from the user endpoint to Microsoft through the global secure access network. This is included in Microsoft 365 E3 capability today, but it allows you to reduce the attack on potential token theft around that, because you're specifying that it's coming from the global secure access network. Other parts of it as well is restricting access to other Microsoft tenants. So that might be partners that you maybe work with, or it might just be other tenants that potential attackers might be using to exfiltrate data. And then another key part, not necessarily around security, but productivity, is that it improves the experience to Microsoft 365 services. So being able to connect to your local point of presence and be able to connect directly there rather than going directly to the data center where your data is residing. If we move on to internet access, this is looking at access to internet sites, so a secure web gateway sort of scenario there, but also being able to integrate conditional access, being able to say to access this category of websites or this website specifically, we need to add multi-factor authentication in front of it, or you need to be on a managed device. So this might help with things where the SaaS applications may not have the capability of MFA for you to be able to add it and then restrict access maybe to the GSA network. Moving on to private profile, this is what John was talking about, talking to on-premise or other cloud infrastructure services, being able to specify what IP address or ports an individual user is allowed to use. So being identity centric rather than just allowing in a traditional sense, just a VPN connection that allows a single or a group of users access, a lot of different resources in that location. If you can go to the next slide. Okay, so let's look at some of the key drivers. So within this, we're seeing the use of, as we've always seen, consolidating, using a single solution across the various identities, the products that are out there. So whilst a lot of organizations have Entra today and using it for as their central identity, this is bringing in the additional side of things around securing access to the internet and to on-premise applications all in one solution. Kind of tying into that is the integrations. So again, bring it into one place, allowing you to do all that configuration in a single pane of glass, as well as integrating with other solutions. So being an issue coming up in Defender XDR, being able to then make changes to conditional access policies to restrict access to different resources based on the risk level, that kind of thing. Prove it to end user experiences. So again, like I said, eliminating extra hops to 365 resources so that you can optimize that connectivity there, as well as being built-in identity governance to be able to do things self-service, reduce the load on IT teams. And as I mentioned before, customers and users looking to move to a zero trust framework, trying to get as much as they can into the pillars that are part of that to allow adaptive access, reduce the use of passwords and things like that. If we jump onto the next slide, please. So some of the frequently asked questions that we get around either Entra Suite or Global Secure Access. Microsoft are quite new or I suppose seem to be new to the security service edge sort of environment. It's probably worth mentioning that if anyone has seen it before, but the Entra application proxy or app proxy, as it's sort of known about, has been around for a long time, and that's been able to give access to on-premise resources via Entra, but only primarily websites. So in effect, private access has been enhanced to from that sort of technology to then be able to do the things it can do today. The other part is around the backbone, so being able to connect with private access or internet access. You'll connect to the Microsoft backbone to get the shortest or the quickest distance to your data in 365 or maybe to those websites. How much effort is it needed for implementation from the Global Secure Access side of things? As always, it's going to depend on what your environment looks like and the complexities within that. But to get core functionality, to get things up and running, is relatively quick. It's more around the policies, maybe network changes if you're using private access for accessing resources on premise and things like that. That maybe that's where the time is taken to get it implemented. How is global secure access different to VPNs? So, like I said, this is slightly different in that the connection from the private access endpoints is outbound, connecting to Microsoft's GSA network, and then any requests to come in then run through that tunnel. So you're not exposing your VPN solution to the internet and being, potentially denial of service attacked against that, or it's not being brute force attacked with password requests up to Entra or to your local Active Directory, etc. Microsoft is in effect in front of all of that and managing that access there. And what makes it different to other solutions? Again, kind of repeating a little bit around this, but it's using Microsoft's backbone side of things, but also it's the integrations with conditional access and the cross-tenant settings. So being able to limit what you do, but also it's that single place where you're specifying what access users have in a single location. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so let's look at what some of the improvements are that this global secure access and Entra Suite can help with, improving your security posture or adding on top of it. So again, zero trust access. And kind of what I just talked about, having that universal conditional access to be able to identify, exactly what users can access from where, from internet websites to private access to 365 and those SaaS applications that everyone does today. Token theft. So recently there has been a lot of common attacks around attackers stealing tokens. This can help define an access point for your users and trust, in effect, a trusted name location, being the global secure access, and then being able to say that when continuous access evaluation takes place when a token is stolen, it's then moved and replayed somewhere else. The access is reevaluated, and in effect, the attack has to re-authenticate there. So reducing that use of token replay there. And data exfiltration. So this is more looking at where we can enforce grounded control around which tenants users can access. So be it that you can restrict specifically, or in effect, you can say what your allow list is for your tenants that you maybe work with partners. So this might be, example, an organization working with ourselves and we have a communication there or sharing within Teams. We can specify each side that we trust each other and that we're allowed to communicate. And now if you had another partner that wasn't on that list, or someone tries to go into a private browser session and try to sign into another tenant, in effect, global secure access is able to block that access and say it's not on the trusted list. So this helps by stopping data being uploaded to SharePoint and OneDrive from a business perspective, because that might be difficult in some scenarios to block from a secure web gateway perspective. Can you go to the next slide? So here's some of the samples or examples of sort of BAU activity. So one which I'll talk around a bit more later is using technology like privileged identity management to be able to do just-in-time access to ports, RDP ports on servers, being able to require approval or schedule, a window where you're allowed to do those changes, bringing that into it. So again, potentially being self-service or requiring approval from that side. Single access control. So being able to manage it all in one place, being able to do reducing the load on which portals you have to access and how that access is done. Like John said, being able to do self-service access to some of these resources for a period of time based on job roles, things like that. Simplifying the identity lifecycle. So being able to automate when users join the organization, being able to give them the role, based on their role or their job, being able to give them the access they need, and when they move to different departments or leave the organization, restricting access as you need. And then continuous monitoring and analytics. So because we're using the global secure access for the internet access and private access, we can see all that activity, that traffic of where users are going to, how much data is kind of going from there, to help analyze maybe what applications may be used, but also being able to help enhance that information for your for your SOC to identify potential risks or help with got to think of the word now, but investigating an incident from that side of things. Can you go to the next slide, please? So delivering some outcomes. So out of bringing Entra Suite into an organization, what can we see from an outcome perspective? So consolidated technology. So optimizing Microsoft licenses, being able to use everything, every part of the license you might have today, and maybe some of these Entra Suite add-ons, being able to utilize everything as we use it all in one area. As we consolidate technology, we have better collaboration between the solutions within Microsoft, diving into Defender XDR, being able to identify risky signals, things like that. Improve security. We've got a single identity location or cloud identity where we're able to manage on-prem access as well as cloud access, even to internet websites. Being able to do that in one place, control it in one environment, helps with making sure that everything is locked down in effect. Reducing risk. So as John said, reducing the blast radius of a potential user based on their access and things like that. And finally, automation self-service, reducing the risk on users, on the IT teams being able to self-serve their access with approvals, etc. But also the onboarding and offboarding of users within an organization, being able to reduce that workload there. And again, that can be quite complex in a large organization where there's multiple services and departments. Reducing that against BAU means that they can work towards improving other services within the organization. If you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so here's a use case that I was kind of talking about previously. So access to RDP SSH over VPN. So initially, the user attempts to access the RDP session remotely, and in effect, Entra comes up and says, or Global Secure Access client says, no, you're not allowed access. You haven't got permission. So the Global Secure Access client, in effect, channels the traffic up there for that port because it's been identified as something that needs to go through GSA, and blocks it. The user then needs to go to Privileged Identity Management as an example, maybe go through an approval process to elevate their role into a group. Once that's kind of gone through, the user can then try within 30 seconds of that being approved and invalidated to then attempt to go through again. So the checks are done as the connection is made across to Entra ID. So you don't have to worry about a policy update to see if you get a new config. It's all done within, I say, near real time sort of capability. Once that is done, then they're allowed access through the private access connector and then to the RDP service. With Privileged Identity Management, once that time runs out, that connection is then broken down, and then they need to re-authenticate again. If MFA is required and they try to do an RDP connection, the RDP session will hold until the prompt comes up from Global Secure Access to require MFA. Once MFA is completed, then that session is then continued. So it doesn't give you, in effect, initially a deny access to the RDP session, it just waits until that everything is validated and then continues that session. If you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so ROI, return on investment kind of thing, we've seen with customers that use Microsoft Entra as well as Go Secure Access, they see a return over 3 years. And again, there's some statistics there. I'll just call some out. 13 hours of additional productivity increased within users because they're not having to wait for tickets to be resolved, or IT teams having to run through a process of onboarding somebody into the organization. And again, reduction, especially on the self-service password reset side of things of Entra, that requests coming to the help desk is being reduced by potentially 75%. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, so what does a proof of concept look like from Go Secure Access? So I'm just going to quickly run through maybe the key stages where you today could look at a proof of concept, try it out yourselves. So initially, as we would see it, you need to have a session internally to identify success criteria, what you want to try and restrict, and kind of scope it quite small initially, because you don't want to in effect boil the ocean, try and build too much in one hit. We'll kind of talk about it later, but Microsoft provide a trial license for a given period of time to allow you to trial the solution, try and work out if it's suitable for replacing a solution, or maybe enhancing what you have today. Next, going on, if you do run through change process, running through what changes need to take place and getting those agreed. And then moving on to configuration. So I'm including all sort of 3 work profiles in here. So creating configuration within the Entra portal for private access, configuration, configuring the applications that you want to be able to access, as well as the ports and the IP addresses, as well as in here, configuring internet categories for internet access and that side of things. The next part would be to deploy the private endpoint, or Entra private endpoint connector, and then okay, thank you. So then going on to Microsoft Entra configuration. So this is more around conditional access, specifying where you can access these resources where they need, creating groups for the proof of concept, and configuring cross-tenant access. And then finally, as part of sort of that build, is deploying the Go Secure Access agent in a proof of concept that might be just manually, or using a device management solution like Intune you may have, or group policy to deploy that across the test users. Then we move into the proof of concept itself. So specifying the test plans, the feedback mechanisms for the users to identify where they have issues, where in effect as part of the proof of concept you can start tweaking policies and configuration to refine, improve experience that you may need to do. On completion of the proof of concept, it's working out the make sure you have that feedback mechanism, discussions around with the test users to identify what the pros and cons from that side of things, as well as removing the user from the solution itself as well. And for a proof of concept, it may have been put in not rapidly, or maybe not at a best practice level, because you may just want to put it in just to make to prove out the technology. And then finally, the next steps from a proof of concept is to identify whether to go ahead with like Go Secure Access, start design policy network, maybe looking at what policies you need to migrate from another solution, or what you need to do to comply with with regulatory compliances. And that's kind of like a typical sort of one. We tend to see the proof of concept maybe 2 to 4 weeks to see that sort of value from the capability within it. If you can go to the next slide. Okay, so how can you get started today? So as I said, Microsoft 365 traffic profile, it's part of your Microsoft 365 E3 licensing today. So being able to start that configuration, enable it in your tenant. Some of the benefits there is that you can start protecting or logging additional information from traffic from 365, improve that connectivity to 365, where if you're in different regions of the world, maybe using the Microsoft backbone, maybe reduce latency from that side of things. You can start identifying tenants that users are using as well. So being able to identify different tenants that users are either B2Bing in or using on their devices. So you can then start to understand what lists you may need to restrict and what is allowed. And in effect, from a deployment perspective, there's a little bit of configuration in Entra, but also just the deployment of the agent to the user endpoints. So today you could get started with that and starting to see some of that functionality. And once, in effect, the Global Secure Access client is rolled out, if you then were looking at internet access, private access, that deployment part is done. It's then just all configuration outside of private access. You needing to deploy, the Entra connectors to have access to on-premise resources. And I think that is it from myself, and back over to you, Mark.
Okay, next slide, please, Fire. I think there was just one slide, Alan, which was just some of the workshops that we have. I think needly to say there are a number of canned workshops that we've deployed for customers in a similar way that can help businesses. Although, as you quite rightly said, there is stuff that you can do to accelerate this very easily yourself. So look, we've got a couple of questions. We're almost at the top of the hour. Alan, I'm going to just give you a second to get a glass of water. John, we had a question I'm going to pose to you. Interestingly, I guess all of us have heard a lot about AI, a lot about Gen AI, and in particular, I guess from a Microsoft perspective, Microsoft Security Copilot. And Microsoft Security Copilot work and is designed to work across that whole suite. But in particular for today's session, from your perspective as an expert within there, where have you seen Security Copilot in real use cases, sort of adding benefit or working well with Entra for businesses today?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Mark. Thanks very much. But so Security Copilot is built into the Entra portal, and I actually see it as one of the more potentially when I say useful, as in the difference between sort of like being able to find the details out. You can go into and find maybe you could say, right, give me the top 10 into Security Copilot, give me the top 10 at-risk user identities, and it will then create you a list. And then you can then say, right, why is that user at risk? And it will then go through all of the logs and actually be able to present to you why that particular user's identity has been seen to be at risk. Or alternatively, you could say, a user sort of like within a log is failing a login, and at the moment you have to go through and understand, right, which is it a conditional access policy? Have we got conditional access policies overlapping with each other? And again, you can then sort of like use sort of like Security Copilot to go in and drag into the all of the logs, the audit logs, and all of the data, and to be able to present that back. So I see that as being able to really help people sort of like within all of the data that we're getting across the environment, because we're getting all of those logs from all of those user identities, both at risk, where are they getting access to, and to actually be able to streamline and to be able to present back simply what exactly is going on with sort of like the user details within Entra ID. So yeah, great question, Mark. And I think, look, it's really going to be one of those areas that I think is going to be really helpful with Security Copilot and across all of the Entra solutions that we have.
Yeah, so definitely benefits we're seeing for, taking some of that grunt work out of being able to streamline and get productivity gains in terms of getting answers quicker, I guess, and better information. So, and I'm sure a number of teams will be wanting to benefit from that. So another question we've got, I think, Alan, I'm going to fire this your way, as you spoke more about GSA. I guess common question we see, but Entra, GSA, does it replace existing VPN solutions or more complementary? What's the position?
Yeah, so I'd say it could be potentially both there. I mean, yes, it is kind of as I talked around my section. It can be a full replacement for global, for a VPN solution, but maybe initially it's a complementary solution as you look to implement it. Maybe it starts taking over some of those services that VPN needs. That you have, well, the requirements that you need for a VPN. It allows you to maybe move from a VPN solution maybe that's talking to on-premise only Active Directory, and you want to move to a more modern identity side of things. So be able to help with that transition as well.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Well, look, I think we're pretty much there, and I'm conscious. I'm thank you so much for everybody that has taken the time to join today. I know time is valuable, and there's a lot of demands on it. And I, thank you, John, Alan. I've just got one last poll question, and I think, look, we've covered an awful lot of ground today, and what's clear is, and we see customers all the time. Entra brings significant value, but it can also be daunting to figure out how best and where to start. And if you recall at the end of Alan's session, he mentioned we have a number of sort of Entra workshops and programs that can help businesses move faster. And these have been built on feedback from businesses just like you, are going on the same journey as you. But so really, and just in terms of helping us build better context and how we can, between Microsoft and us, shape and deliver this more easily for businesses, we thought we'd ask the next poll question. Sophia, could you fire that poll question up, please? So in terms of how we engage, and as I said, we will look to follow up with you. Which of the following options would you typically be most interested in helping you to understand more about how to sort of get the benefits from the Entra suite and GSA? So 1, 30-day access for Entra Internet and the access licenses. 1-hour session with someone like Alan to help guide that, or maybe is that too much straight away? You want a little bit more time with maybe someone a consultant just to really sort of go through some of this stuff and a quick call to reorientate. Which would be the most useful? Okay. Right. Can't see the results as yet on my screen, but I'm sure they're building up anyway. Okay, great. So look, thank you again, everybody, for taking the time to join. Just to follow up, we will reach out following this just to gain feedback and make sure and follow up to see if there's anything, or indeed whether you want a follow-up session, and indeed answer any questions you may have. Unless there's anything else or any other questions, John, Alan, thank you very much for going through the stuff you did today. Thank you all for joining, and hopefully we'll be speaking to you in the not too distant future. Thank you very much, everybody.